Well, today's guest in Perspective is Mike Duncan. He's a voice behind the award-winning podcast, The History of Rome, and also Revolutions, with analysis on France, Russia, Haiti, and more. He's also a New York Times best-selling author. I'm guessing you like the sound of that, Mike.
I do like the sound of that.
Not bad. Well, thank you for coming into France 24. He's also going to speak to us today about his career, and maybe we can get a few questions for him about connecting the dots between yesterday and tomorrow, and he'll tell us if we should be scared or hopeful about the state of the world. Mike, I want to begin. We have some avid listeners in the newsroom, and my colleague Malcolm has a question for you. How did you get into podcasts, history podcasts of all things? Was it the money or the groupies?
It was the money and the groupies, also the fame and the glory. No, when I started The History of Rome in 2007, podcasting obviously existed, and there were some history podcasts that were out there, but it wasn't some great media phenomenon. It would be years before I had to. The very first thing that would come out of my mouth when people asked what I would do, and I would say I do this history podcast, and people would say, "Oh, what's a podcast?" That went on for years and years and years. So I got into it essentially because it was a way to express this deep, passionate love I had, particularly for Roman history and just explaining history to people in general. I like to share my own historical knowledge with other people. I like to spread it around. I think a society that is historically literate is probably going to function better than a society that is not historically literate. So that was really all I was trying to do, is just share what was inside of me. And then it took a number of years before podcasting then became a thing. And now people come up to me and say, "Wow, you got in on the ground floor of podcasting." I didn't know it was the ground floor of podcasting at the time.
Is it profitable?
It is right now profitable for me. Mm-hmm. Yes.
It's taken a while to build up enough.
I built up enough of an audience over the years that between advertising and between listener donations and book sales, I have been able to go from this being a hobby to then for a while it was a part-time job, and then it became my full-time job.
Now, there are a lot of weekly podcasts, but I'm guessing very, very few have the amount of content and research that goes into yours. When you listen to your podcast, I don't know how on earth you can release one of those every single week with the amount of research. How much work goes behind each episode?
A 30-minute episode will usually have about 30 hours of work that goes into it, between doing the research, taking the notes, I write the scripts. I don't just talk. I write scripts, editing the scripts, recording it. Usually that's about 30 hours of work to do. 30 minutes.
30 hours of love.
Yeah, 30 hours of love. And I do love it. It's what I would be doing if I wasn't doing a podcast. In between my jobs, I would be doing this same, where I would still be interested enough in history that I would be doing it in my spare time. I've just been lucky enough that now it's what I do for a living. In
your Revolutions podcast, you speak about France, you speak about Russia, Mexico, you speak about a number of countries. How many of these places were you already familiar with, or was a job pushing you to look into them? Or
I went into it with a pretty good knowledge of the American Revolution and the French Revolution, and also the Russian Revolution was the other one that I knew a lot about, that I knew I would be going into, or when I started the show, I knew eventually I would get to the Russian Revolution. Those are the ones I knew the most about. The one that I had to learn the most about, that I am most gratified for having really taught myself about it and then shared it, was the Haitian Revolution, which I think is probably one of the greatest undercovered stories and under-talked about events in world history. I went into revolutions knowing that it was a great slave rebellion that happened in Saint-Domingue, but the details of it are fascinating beyond almost anything else that I've covered. And that was one that I didn't know a lot about, that now I know a lot about, and I'm really happy I shared it with people.
Well, I have another colleague in the newsroom, Chris. He's of Haitian descent, and he said, You nailed it. He said you touched every major point in the Haitian Revolution. Yeah. He's listened to this podcast every day of his commute. You're ending Revolutions next year. He wants to know what you're going to offer him to replace it.
What I am going to offer to replace Revolutions will be something that I will announce by the time Revolutions comes to an end.
There's two. You can't break the news now on France 24.
You're not going to get a scoop here from me today. There's 3 to 5 ideas that probably by the time I have to pick one, it will be none of those 3 to 5 ideas. Right. So I'll just keep it in my pocket.
All right. Well, you're living in France now.
Yes.
Has that affected how you look at the French Revolution?
I think it has. I think it would be difficult to not immerse yourself in the culture of where events took place and not have it influence your thinking on things. And especially, I mean, so I've done series on the 1830 Revolution, I've done the 1848 French Revolution, did the Paris Commune, and having done those things, I arrived here in the summer of 2018, which is right when the Gilets jaunes were beginning. And I live in central Paris, and a lot of those Gilets jaunes, those early, really violent clashes that were happening in the streets back in the fall and winter of 2018, 2019, were happening underneath my window. And so that's quite a different personal take on what's happening in a revolutionary situation than just being ensconced in a house in Madison, Wisconsin, where I'm talking about, the Parisians are marching this way and that way, and they're trashing things, and then suddenly it's happening right outside my window.
I didn't know you're from Madison, Wisconsin. I went to school at Madison, Wisconsin.
You did?
Yes, I did.
Lovely.
Well,
lovely.
Tell me this now.
Yes.
You've studied the Roman Empire, populist mob. Do you draw any parallels from then and today, whether it's the U.S., whether it's in Europe? Do you see any parallels that we can glean information from history about the way the world is today?
Yes. And if you're really interested, then you should all pick up my book, The Storm Before the Storm, the beginning of the end of the Roman Republic, which
New
is
York Times bestselling author.
Yeah,
If we forgot
that was
to mention.
lovely. My great concern right now is that economic inequality created structural problems between what the Roman state was supposed to be delivering for its citizens and what those citizens were actually receiving. And in the lead up to the breakdown of the Roman Republic, so we're talking not the fall of the Roman Empire, which is 500 years later, but the collapse of the Roman Republic into sort of a military dictatorship of the Caesars. There was a great deal of widening economic inequality where the elites who were in control of Rome, the Senate, were gobbling up all the wealth, all the power, all the available resources, and leaving most of the citizenry behind. And there was a movement led by the Gracchi brothers in the 120s and teens BC to attempt to address some of these issues. And the elites in Rome ignored all of this, and they didn't want it to happen. And eventually it took violence on the part of the conservative elite to beat back this populist challenge to them that I think, having not addressed those issues at a moment when they could have addressed them, and they just let them go on, leads 50 years later, 60 years later, 70 years later to the kind of like large-scale warlord-driven civil wars that ultimately is what collapsed the Republic into a military dictatorship. So if you look out at the world today, in the European Union, in the United States, I think you do have the same kind of intransigent and I would dare say myopic financial and political elite who are very desperately trying to ignore all of these things. And I think that they ignore all of these things at their peril.
Food for thought. Mike, we have to leave it there. Thank you very much for coming into France 24, though. Mike Duncan, history podcaster. You can find his podcast on all major platform systems, and I recommend you do.